want to congratulate you in a perhaps more meaningful way too, and that is you showed a fair bit of courage by coming out and talking about policy issues, policy reforms, challenges for Labor, even before the leadership issue was settled. You were demanding a much more pragmatic approach to economic development and coal mining and the resources generally, and you said if you didn't get satisfactory responses you might run for the leadership yourself. I suppose giving you the job of Shadow Resources Minister is that assurance?
And I was determined to run if I felt it necessary to get the party back into the centre and talking about our own policies. I mean, Chris, it's the Labor's policy to mine coal and to export it to global markets. Always has been. I think always will be. The difficulty we had pre-election was that we weren't really prepared to talk about that, to boast those credentials, and I'm determined that we talk about it more. We acknowledge the value of the coal mining industry to our economy and the regional jobs it creates, and the mining industry more generally, of which, of course, coal is a relatively minor component. We are the biggest coal exporter in the world, but, gee, we produce more iron ore than anyone else, and we have an enrichment of rare earths, which, of course, will be important to the future economy.
Yeah, obviously, Bill Shorten and the rest of the Labor team, you had a lot of trouble before the election talking about Adani. Obviously, you didn't want to have full-throated support for the Adani coal mine because you feared it would cost you votes in the inner city because of the climate issue. Does Labor now have a clear position on that Adani coal mine in Queensland?
Well, I won't agree with your motivation, but certainly we weren't prepared to make an unequivocal stance on Adani. And as I've said many times, what we should have been saying is, yes, it has to stand on its own 2 feet financially. Yes, it has to pass the most stringent environmental tests. But if it does, we welcome the investment and the jobs. That's what we should have been saying. Now, Adani will be done and dusted by the time the next federal election comes around, where the opposition almost certainly for 3 years. So let's get beyond Adani and just make the clear point that if a project, any mining project, can stand on its own 2 feet, can pass the most stringent environmental hurdles, then the Labor Party should and will support it.
Does that include the exportation of more coal for domestic needs? Does Labor see that if a project stacks up to increase coal-fired electricity generation in this country to bolster our dispatchable energy, that you could approve such a development?
Well, look, our objective was to reach 50% renewables by 2030, Chris. Axiomatically, then you need to get 50% of your energy from another source. And of course, that other source, well into the future, will be fossil fuels, coal and gas. So we had a policy, when you think about it that way, of securing half of our energy needs from fossil fuels. But did we say it? No. And by equivocating on Adani, the issue became emblematic. And it provided our political opponents with an opportunity to turn that into an anti-coal mining stance, something which affected us not only in central and north Queensland, but of course in the Hunter Valley, which I represent, of course.
Are Labor's climate policies, these increased goals for 50% renewable and for a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030, were these too ambitious? Were these seen as too reckless by the electorate? And is there a chance to perhaps wind back those targets?
Well, let's just take them one by one. I don't think or believe 50% renewables was overly ambitious. I think under the government, the market will take us, this government, I think the market will take us there anyway. Both people in households and private sector investors are scrambling to invest more and more in renewable energy. In my own hometown of Cessnock, we have under construction a 5 megawatt solar farm. So they add up pretty quickly. So I don't see how that could have been too ambitious. The 45% reduction, by international standards, indeed, is quite modest. I think it was a reasonable goal to have, but we didn't explain well enough how we intended to get there. And again, we opened ourselves up to a bit of a scare campaign, but that's not an excuse. I say if you open yourself up to a scare campaign you can expect.
But the issue here is Labor initially agreed, of course, to the Paris commitments, and the government is committed to the Paris commitments. That's a 26 to 28% reduction in emissions by 2030. What would be wrong with Labor coming back to the Paris commitments? It was once a bipartisan national goal. It is what Australia's signed up to under international agreements. And you could always reserve the right, of course, that should Australia get to that position either by 2030 or earlier without too much problem, well, then you can increase your targets. But why not just settle for the Paris commitments to start with?
Well, let's put targets aside, because they are, in fact, an aspiration, an agreement to strive to reach a goal. What is important, I think, is that carbon emissions in Australia have gone up year on year for the last 4 years. So I think we should spend less time talking about targets and international agreements and more time talking about what is happening here in Australia. And it's unacceptable that our emissions continue to grow when the world, the globe, is moving together in an attempt to reduce emissions.
That's a fair point. You've got to keep if the government's committed to Paris, then you've got to make sure they actually are accountable and meet those targets. But doesn't that just underscore the point that surely where Labor should be now is not aiming for 45% reductions, but just setting its sights to having a bipartisan commitment to those Paris targets?
Well, I certainly agree with you on bipartisanship. I mean, Tony Burke made the point, as the former Environment Shadow, that we've been trying now for 10 years or more to get a settlement on a market-based approach to carbon reductions. And, you know, the definition of madness is to keep, doing the same thing over and over and expect to get a different result. It's obvious to me, at least, and I think many in the Labor Party now, that the coalition forces are not going to settle on a market-based approach, as close as they've been on a number of occasions. I think 14 different policies over the last 6 years, but they're going to double down now. And if we're going to be serious about getting carbon output down, then we need to reach out across the aisle and say, OK, where are you prepared to work with us to start driving emissions down rather than continue to allow them to rise? Climate change remains very, very important, Chris. I'm in the agriculture portfolio as well. I've been there for 6 years. And I think our agriculture sector is in real trouble and will remain in trouble without a change in direction, both in terms of government guidance and the attitudes and directions taken by farm leadership.
All right, well, we'll keep in touch over those issues. I just wanted to finish up with a broader issue, and that is economic management. You, like me, grew up and saw the economic success, the economic reforms of the Hawke-Keating years. That's when Labor used to talk about aspirational politics. That's when Labor looked at policies and enacted policies that helped families in the suburbs and the regions get ahead. And I've been saying for the last 10 years, especially the last couple of years, your higher taxing, higher spending, redistribution politics have sort of turned their back on the Hawke-Keating years, and obviously that was rejected by voters just over 2 weeks ago. I noticed yesterday that the new Shadow Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, is talking about aspiration and people getting ahead. He seems to have rediscovered that Hawke-Keating version of aspirational politics. I think that's a significant shift for Labor and the right one. Do you agree?
Well, every politician should just ask themselves the question, what do you want for your children? And we all aspire to every generation having opportunity and to climb that aspirational ladder. If we start making that a basis of our policy approach, in my view, we can't go wrong. You are right. Many people found our policies in the lead up to the last election very complex. And I've made the point before, when we said we were going to take from the rich to give to the poor, we didn't clearly define who the rich are. And many of my coal miners, for example, who are, might be on $160,000, $170,000 a year, might have a negatively geared home and have some important aspirations for their children, were asking themselves whether the Labor Party was talking about them. And I believe that's understandable. We didn't articulate the message well, and we need to learn from those lessons.
But in specific policy terms, then, when you talk about that sort of example, a couple of policies you'd have to look at either changing or dropping is the increased tax rate for the top marginal income tax rate and also the negative gearing changes.
And they will be all under review. As Anthony Albanese has said, he's not going to make policy on the run without proper process and consultation. Nothing will escape the review. But aspiration, of course, starts with education. If you want to give every person the opportunity to fully participate in the economy and meet their aspirations, it has to begin with a sound education. So investment in education and other social infrastructure will remain important. Governments, plural, whatever the political persuasion, have to work out where that investment, where that funding will come from. So, we need to look at both sides of the equations, but on the economic front, aspiration has to be underlined every time we're reviewing these policies and should remain foremost in our minds going forward.